So when we look at evolution, start out by giving it a description, right? A definition here. Any change in a species over time, meaning any change in a population or a group of organisms that are of the same species, when they change over time, that's evolution. Did we evolve? Today, just did us as a group, did we change?
Yeah, we got
yes.
taller.
Did any individual change? No. Did anyone grow? No. So individuals do not evolve. Only populations evolve. Only groups evolve. So we're going to look at two things. How to measure if evolution is happening, right? So that you can look and go, yes, it's happening, or no, it's not. And then the second thing we're going to look at is how does evolution occur? Evolution's all about changing genes that are in a population. So if the types of genes or if the number of the different types of genes changes, then evolution has occurred. If it stays stable, that's called genetic equilibrium. It's the opposite of evolution. So if populations do have changes to their genes, evolution, otherwise we call it genetic equilibrium. And I want to point something out here. That means that populations can have some traits that are evolving and some traits that are not. Okay? All right. So the first type of trait that we can look at in terms of is evolution happening is called a single gene trait. A single gene trait, just like the name implies, is any trait that is controlled by just one gene. And so you usually have just two alleles for a particular gene, meaning that you have either the dominant or the recessive. What type of inheritance pattern are you seeing on the bottom left? And it might help to compare it to the bottom right. So in the bottom left, how many different phenotypes are there? In the bottom right, how many? So what type of inheritance pattern would we see that only has two phenotypes? Simple. And then, there we go. Ooh, well, that's not what I wanted to do. There we go, erase that. And then on the bottom right, then, what's that an example of? Codominance. But either way, it's really easy to measure, and you can look at that and see how many organisms have each type of phenotype. To actually be able to measure evolution, you would have to know their genotype. So let's take a look at this population. Take a look at the unicorns on the left. Which allele seems more common, big A or little a? Okay, here's what I need you to do. How many individuals are there that are homozygous big A? Homozygous big A meaning big A, big A. So we've got two. How many are heterozygous, meaning two different alleles?
6.
Reminder there, alleles are different forms of the gene. In this case, either the blue gene or the green gene. Okay? How many homozygous little a? In other words, the recessive. Okay. Now we're going to look at the frequency. How many different unicorns are there in the population? 10. How many alleles do they each have? Which means how many different alleles are there in the population? Right? Each individual has two, either a big A, a big A, a big A, a little a, or a little a and a little a. So if you take, so that means 2 total per individual, 10 individuals, 20 different alleles that are in that group. How many of them are big A? Huh. The frequency of big A is 50%. Half of all the A's, either big or little, half of them are big A in this population. What is the frequency of little a? Also 10. Okay. Go ahead and count them up for homozygous big A after the 50th generation. So we've evolved, we've had some time to reproduce and whatnot. How many homozygous big A are there in the 50th generation? Uno. Right? Cha. How many are heterozygotes? And how many homozygous little a? Okay. We still have 20 different alleles, or 20 alleles, not different. How many are big A?
6.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Which means, what are the rest of them? 14 that are little a. Has this population evolved? Did the allele frequency, did the types of alleles they had, or the number of alleles of each type, did that change? This population changed. Simple enough? Okay. There we go. So what we're getting into now then are what are called polygenic traits. Rather than having one gene or another, right, having just one gene control it, but you have one allele or a different allele. In polygenic traits, you have a whole bunch of different genes that control the trait. For example, height is controlled by a whole bunch of different genes, and what you tend to have are a range of phenotypes. In the case of height, we'd expect that most people fall right around the average. There's going to be plenty of people that are a little above average, plenty of people that are a little below. But as you get out towards, CJ status, way off to the sides, it becomes less and less common. So you're not going to see people who are 7 foot on your day-to-day basis. You're not going to see adults who are 4 foot on the day-to-day basis. So we can measure evolution by just looking at single gene traits because the alleles change. But in polygenic traits, we have a whole spectrum, and they get a lot more difficult to track, to look at individual genes. So I've given you a population of unicorns. What color are most of the unicorns? Kind of that bluish green, right in between, right? Most fall in the middle. How many really green ones are there? Yeah, 1 or 2. Depends on how really we want to call really green. How many really blue are there? And then some right in between, right? Measuring evolution in polygenic traits is a lot more difficult. As I said, you can't just look at, do you have the trait or not? You have to look at the whole range. So when it comes to polygenic traits, we measure evolution by if that curve changes. For example, if this population of unicorns was to evolve and become more green, where green was more and more popular, this would be called directional selection. If you had a population where really blue and really green were not very likely to have many offspring, and so you didn't have as many of them, but the teal kept going, this is called stabilizing selection. And when you have the ones that are right in the middle, the average becoming less and less common, that's an example of what's called disruptive selection. So when we're looking at human birth weight, if you're very, very small, you're not very likely to survive. If you're very, very large, you're not likely to have your mother survive and be able to make siblings for you. So what population or what group within the population is most likely to be able to continue to survive and reproduce? That is, what group is like the highest outcome of doing goodly, right? That middle. So that's going to be our example of a stabilizing selection, because individuals in the middle become more and more common, whereas extremes become less and less common. We can think of an example of mice. Here's what you can picture. If I just have mice, whatever, doing their little micey things, and most of the mice are tan. There's some white ones, there's some brown ones, but it's definitely most common for them to be tan. If we take those mice and drop them off on a deserted island that has beautiful white sands, what's going to happen to the mice? Okay, they're going to start shifting. What happens if you're a really dark brown mouse on white sands?
Either going to get you.
you become snack. You're dead. What happens to tan? Same thing. You're obvious, you stand out, you get eaten. What happens to the white mice? They have a higher rate of survival. That becomes the more common color. And so that is an example of what type of selection? Directional selection. How about if that same island has a volcano that erupts, and the volcano doesn't kill the mice right away? Instead, what happens is that the lava hardens and turns into a really dark rock. What's going to happen to the white mice?
They're snacks.
They're still sand. Okay. So if you are a white mouse, so long as you stay on the white sand, you're fine. If you are a brown mouse, what happens?
You'll be fine as long as you stay on the road.
Yeah. Move to the darker rock and you'll be fine. Or less obvious at least. What happens to the tan mice?
They're still snacks.
Nom, 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 nom. Dead tan mice. So this is going to be your example of disruptive selection, where the two extremes become more common and the one in the middle becomes the least common. So we can start looking now at how evolution happens. We know how to tell if it happened, but we've got to talk about 3 mechanisms that cause evolution, and they are natural selection, artificial selection, and genetic drift. Okay? We're going to start out by talking about natural selection. This is when individuals that can survive and reproduce take their genes and pass them on down to the next generation. That means the new generation is going to be more like the ones that survived, and all the ones that died off don't pass their genes, and therefore those traits are less likely to be expressed or passed on. Okay? When it comes to natural selection, 3 things you need: variation, competition, and adaptations. So the example that we started at the beginning with the young tree, that is natural selection. What was your variation? What was it that was different between all of you? Okay. And if there was no competition, if the young tree just made unlimited kisses, chocolate kisses, and just dropped all the extras and it was fine, and all of you lived, would we have evolved? Would our population have changed at all? No, because everyone that we started with would have gotten food, would have been able to survive, and evolution would not have occurred. So you need that competition to kill off some. That leads to this last idea. An adaptation is a specific trait that allows some variations to be more beneficial than others. In this case, what was our adaptation? What was it that some people had and other people didn't that allowed them to be able to survive? Being tall. Okay. In this case, being tall was the adaptation. Raise your hand if you had the adaptation. You survived, right? If you were tall enough, you survived. Mutant.
Well, you only survived because you're smarter than the other people.
So in the case of adaptations, what's really confusing is how commonly people use the phrase like, you just need to adapt to it. You'll get used to it. You just need to adapt. No. In biology, you don't adapt to things. Groups do, but individuals do not. You did not all of a sudden get tallness. You stayed one height. You either had the adaptation or you didn't. Are the same adaptations always good though? Let's take, for example, furriness. Let's say I've got a group of bunnies. Most bunnies are somewhere in the middle. Some are kind of bald. They call them naked bunnies. Some are super duper fluffy. Which one is the adaptation? What's the best? So let's say that you've got a population of bunnies, and like medium fluffiness is in the middle, and like naked is down here. I like naked. That's a great way to spell it. And super fluff is up here, right? What's best? Which is best? Raise your hand if you say being a naked bunny is the best. Raise your hand if you say a medium fluffiness bunny is the best. Raise your hand if you say super fluff is the best. And raise your hand if you don't know. What? Thank you. It all depends on the environment. If I send this population of bunnies out into the desert, what's the best? Yeah. You don't want to be a naked bunny in the tundra, and you don't want to be a super fluffy bunny if you're in the desert. So adaptations. A snake snack. Okay. So this is. So the adaptations are going to only be based on the environment that you are talking about. Being tall was beneficial because the plant was tall. If the plant was like shoved into some crevice deep inside of a rock, it's not going to help you to be tall. It's going to help you to be kind of small. Okay. That's going to lead me to the last question. Natural selection is usually referred to as survival of the fittest. So we need to talk about that term fitness. Who in this classroom believes that they are the most fit? Point to the person that you would say, based on biological terminology, that person is the most fit.
Not me.
You're all wrong.
Are you sure about that? Why, yeah.
What makes me the most fit person in here? Well, when we say survival of the fittest, what ultimately is natural selection about?
Your mind.
Getting genes into the next generation. Who has the most genes in the next generation right now? So.
CJ just saw me going. What's up, dog? I'm just going.
Okay. Fitness is all about getting your genes into the next generation. Those who have the most adaptations for their environment are the most fit. So when Darwin talked about survival of the fittest, he wasn't talking about, oh, you're big or strong. It was just that, hey, you have the most adaptation. So speaking of, go ahead and look at natural selection. So individuals that can survive and reproduce, higher likelihood, etc. I want you to go back a few hundred years. Here's Charles Darwin, my man, Chucky D. Okay? And he wrote a book called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection that outlined his theory, which said that natural selection, that this process that I just described for you guys, this process is what causes species to evolve. Go back 200, 300 years. How would that idea be received? How would people feel about the idea that was being presented? Oh, why? Because you're absolutely right. Grant, why'd they hate it? Because you're right.
Different.
What? Hey, what does Genesis say?
In the Bible?
The first book of the Bible states that God created
God is my dad.
everything. God created the animals in a fixed form, guys. God created plants in a fixed form. Coming in here and not only saying that species evolve, they change, but hey, I think I know how it happens, caused Charles Darwin to be incredibly ridiculed and criticized by even the scientific community, who were like, yeah, we get it, but you're making us look bad, man. But nonetheless, after 30-ish years of collecting data and doing experiments and trying to understand this process, he finally published this theory. We need to talk about that word theory. Theory means what? Are theories just thoughts, ideas that you have? I got a theory about who stole my lunch money.
I mean,
My bully.
that's a theory, basically.
Has been tested. Okay? A theory has not only been tested, but it has been heavily scrutinized. Darwin came out with this book in 1859, I want to say. So we're going on over 150 years that this book has been out. Have we ever disproved the theory of evolution by natural selection? So if we've never disproved it, despite the fact that people have tried, that means that it's incredibly well supported. We have the evidence to support that this happens. And theories explain how things happen, right? We talked about cell theory at the beginning of the year. It is a theory because it describes like how organisms are built. This theory describes how organisms change over time. And not only did it explain how organisms changed over time, but it also explained this. The theory of common descent says that our ancient ancestor is the same for every organism on Earth. That one organism, one little microbe, is the ancestor to everything on Earth. And the way that everything else on Earth arose is by billions of years of mutations and natural selection and various processes happening that led to everything. Every bacteria, every fungus, every animal, every plant arose from a common ancestor. Now, obviously, animals all have a more common ancestor than animals have with plants, for example. Okay? So because of natural selection, we can understand this idea of common descent, where all living things evolved from a single ancient ancestor. Mind-blowing? Anybody? So our second way that we're going to look at of how evolution happens is artificial selection. And to be able to understand, let's look at artificial selection. Individuals that can survive and reproduce, exactly the same. The only difference is that humans are the ones dictating what traits get passed on. So it's not about just who has the adaptation to allow them to survive in their environment. It's who's the most beneficial to a human. So if I'm a farmer and I've got 200 cows in my field, and I know that I cannot support more than 200 cows, what am I going to do in terms of allowing breeding to occur to maximize my beef output for future generations? Beef. Which cows get to mate? Okay. I'm going to take the biggest cows in my field and make sure that they mate. And all the rest of them sounds like a Burger King issue to me. Okay? So my next generation looks what compared to the original? Bigger, a little bit beefier, right? Because I take those cows, they breed to make the new 200, and now which of those cows do I breed for my next generation? The biggest ones. Modern cows are so big and so not well suited to their environment that they cannot breed on their own. A lot of them can't breed on their own. The only way that you can make more baby cows is with the unpleasant job of artificially inseminating a female. If anyone's interested, Micro had an episode on it. For artificial selection, it's the same thing as breeding. Those two terms can be used kind of interchangeably. Okay. Whoops, I just went to the wrong place. That's okay. To be able to understand this, the last way that evolution happens is by chance. It's not because anybody had genes that were better or worse for an environment or that humans wanted or didn't want. It's just due to chance. So the first is called the founder effect, and this is going to be when a group breaks off from the total population. Boys. With the founder effect, if that group that breaks away from the rest of the population has genes that are even just a little bit different, maybe they don't have a particular gene for something, or they do have a more commonly expressed gene for something. By them separating away from the original population, you now have two populations that are genetically distinct. They're still the same species. They can still mate, but they've evolved in terms of your genetic makeup is just a little bit different than the original. What population of people tended to settle in this area, in the Susquehanna Valley area, and then all the way over into Ohio? What's a language that we hear a lot in York and Lancaster counties? Pennsylvania Dutch. Where are the Pennsylvania Dutch from? Germany. Okay. So the founder effect, we can look at that by looking at the Amish population. It is, but Pennsylvania Dutch are still German because confusion.
They were Dutch, but they were actually German.
All right. So we can look at this almost like the German population, and this is the Amish population. In this case, if we're looking at the Germans as the original population and the Amish as kind of a subpopulation that split off, which is absolutely what happened, then you can expect that they'd have different ratios of different genes, and that turns out to be the case. The Amish do not have certain diseases that are very, very prevalent in everybody else, because the few people that separated from the Germans and came over to America didn't have those diseases. I think one has to do with hypercholesteremia, in other words, having high cholesterol. But they do have a higher incidence of certain diseases that affect children, and especially that cause severe mental delays and disability. So because they've got that different set of alleles than what the overall population started with, that is an example of evolution, and it is caused completely by chance in what's called the founder effect. So the founder effect is one type of evolution by chance, in other words, genetic. And the other type is very, very similar, except for here, we're killing a bunch of organisms. So in the bottleneck effect, if a whole bunch of the population dies off, then what you're left with is likely to have a different allele frequency and a different gene pool than what you originally had. Of course, humans suck. We know this. We've killed almost everything on Earth. We've killed over 90% of whales, of actually most large mammal species. And because of that, their genetic makeup is much, much narrower. They have a way smaller gene pool. And so this is an example of the bottleneck effect, because you've lost all the genes that might have been part of the original population. Yeah, we suck. Anyway. All right, let's do a quick overview. Sharon. So, quick overview. When it comes to evolution, our definition here, a change in species over time. We know that we can measure it in terms of their genetics. And so to measure evolution, we look at either single gene traits or polygenic traits. Single gene traits, if you have a change in allele frequency, then that means that evolution has occurred. In traits that are polygenic, that is, you have a whole range of phenotypes, most of them tend to be in the middle in this normal distribution. If that curve moves at all, then that's evolution. It can curve in one direction, which is directional selection. It can kind of come up towards the middle, that's stabilizing selection. Or you can have an event occur, or something where the individuals that are average tend to have a decreased fitness, and then a higher fitness on the two ends, which is going to be that disruptive selection and make something that looks like that. In terms of how evolution happens, most of it is due to natural selection, but artificial selection and genetic drift play a part as well. With natural selection, you need variation, competition, and adaptations. So far, so good on all of those terms. Okay? Charles Darwin's the first dude to describe it, and he was all like, woo woo, and everyone was like, yeah, you suck. And because of the fact that Charles Darwin described this process of natural selection, it does imply that we do have common ancestors and that they diverge, and that at some point we all shared a common ancestor. Questions, comments, concerns, thoughts, suggestions, anecdotes, anything? Don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell.